2 minutes. That's all Donald Trump says he needs to erase a country from the map. Not 2 weeks, not 2 months, 2 minutes. While you're reading this sentence, Iran's ballistic missiles are already locked on coordinates in Tel Aviv and Washington. While diplomats shake hands in Islamabad, unidentified rockets are slamming into Turkish airspace for the fourth time. And while Europe debates whether this is even their war, Spain just slammed its skies shut against American warplanes, defying the most powerful military alliance in human history. The Middle East is no longer on the edge of explosion. It already exploded. What you're watching right now is the shockwave spreading outward, toward NATO, toward Europe, toward every corner of this planet. Stay with me, because in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to break down every single piece of this puzzle. Iran's revenge doctrine, Israel's death penalty law, Trump's 2-minute threat, Spain's historic defiance, and the mystery rockets over Turkey. By the end of this video, you will understand not just what is happening, but why it was always going to come to this. Let's start with the most dangerous shift happening right now, one that most mainstream media is either ignoring or dramatically underreporting. Iran has officially moved from a defensive military posture to an offensive revenge posture. This is not speculation. This is not propaganda. This is a formal declaration made through Iran's military command structure, specifically through the Al-Anbiya Central Headquarters spokesperson Ibrahim Zulfikari, and it changes everything. For years, Iran's strategy was what analysts called strategic patience. When attacked, Iran would respond through proxy forces, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq and Syria. It would retaliate indirectly, maintaining what diplomats called plausible deniability. Iran could absorb strikes, respond through intermediaries, and keep the conflict below the threshold of all-out war. That doctrine is now dead. What replaced it is something far more dangerous and far more direct. Iran's military has now formally designated the personal residences, private quarters, and sleeping locations of enemy commanders, politicians, and heads of state as legitimate military targets. Read that again. Not military bases, not weapons depots, not radar installations, personal homes, private quarters, the places where American generals sleep, where Israeli cabinet ministers live with their families, where decision-makers rest at night believing reinforced walls keep them safe. Iran is now saying, nowhere is safe for you. This declaration didn't come from nowhere. It came directly in response to what Iran describes as a series of targeted assassinations and infrastructure strikes that eliminated several senior Iranian commanders and devastated key facilities, strikes that Tehran says began in earnest around February 28, 2026, under what Iran calls the trigger point for Operation Epic Wrath. The logic Iran is applying is brutal in its simplicity. You used our leaders' homes and offices as targets. Now we will use yours. Iranian military spokesmen have been explicit. Our missiles and kamikaze drones recognize no geographical borders. Our target database now includes the precise coordinates of enemy elites, their nighttime rest locations, and their official residential quarters. They sit behind concrete walls and give orders to destroy our cities, believing distance protects them. They are wrong. This is not rhetoric for domestic consumption. This is a strategic doctrine shift, one designed to do something very specific. To make every American and Israeli official personally feel the threat that ordinary Iranian civilians have lived with for decades. The message from Tehran is unmistakable. If you make our leaders' personal safety negotiable, we will make yours negotiable too. The alliance chain that once kept this conflict from going fully personal has now been severed. Now let's turn to Washington, because what Donald Trump has been saying deserves far more scrutiny than it's been getting. Trump declared that the Iranian regime has already changed. The old regime is gone, those people are dead, and the people America is now negotiating with are completely different individuals. More professional, he said. More cooperative. Now, there are two ways to read this. Either Trump genuinely believes that the strikes carried out against Iran have been so effective that an entirely new power structure has emerged in Tehran, or this is Trump doing what Trump does best, which is narrating a reality into existence that he wants people to believe is already true. Tehran's response was instant and unambiguous. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Ismail Baqiai called Washington's negotiating proposals a collection of irrational demands and fantasies. He said Iran had received them, read them, and thrown them in the trash. He signed off his response with a sarcastic message: "Have a good flight, Mr. Trump." But here is where it gets truly alarming. Because Trump didn't just claim the regime had changed. He issued a direct, specific, timed ultimatum. He stated publicly that if a deal is not reached in the near future, and specifically if the Strait of Hormuz is not opened for business, the United States will conclude its Iranian engagement by destroying every power station, every oil well, and Karg Island in its entirety. Karg Island, the facility responsible for roughly 90% of Iran's oil export capacity, the economic heart of the Iranian state. Gone. In 2 minutes, Trump said, "We've been intentionally leaving them alone. But our patience is not unlimited. We can do this in 2 minutes." And then, in the same breath, Trump pivoted to Cuba. He said Cuba is in severe crisis, that the United States will be there soon, and that order will be established. Just like that. One country to the next. 2 minutes here, order restored there. This is what maximum pressure looks like when its practitioner has abandoned even the pretense of diplomatic language. Trump is not threatening Iran. He is narrating Iran's destruction as though it's an administrative task, something to be scheduled between press briefings and phone calls with Gulf state leaders. The question the world is now asking is not whether Trump means it. The question is whether Iran, facing economic strangulation, military pressure, and the assassination of its leadership, has any incentive left to negotiate at all. Now I need to talk about a piece of legislation passed in Israel that received surprisingly little coverage, given that it may be the single most consequential legal decision made in this entire conflict. The Israeli Knesset has formally passed the terrorist death penalty law of 2026. The vote: 62 in favor, 47 opposed, 1 abstention. The law grants Israeli courts, and by extension Israeli security forces, formal legal authority to impose the death penalty on individuals convicted of terrorism. The Speaker of the Knesset announced it plainly. The terrorist death penalty law of 2026 has passed its second and third readings. This law is now entered into the book of Israeli law. National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir expressed unconcealed satisfaction. Prime Minister Netanyahu, at the cabinet meeting that followed, endorsed the decision without hesitation. Now let me be precise about what this means in practice, because the headline alone doesn't capture the full weight of this. There are currently approximately 10,000 Palestinian prisoners held in Israeli detention facilities. 10,000 people who, under this newly passed law, now face a legal pathway to execution. Experts who have analyzed the legislation's language note that its definition of terrorism is broad enough that it could legally be applied to a vast majority of Palestinian detainees. Not just combatants, not just individuals who carried out attacks. Broad enough to encompass political resistance, affiliation with organizations Israel designates as terrorist, and even acts of civil disobedience in certain contexts. The humanitarian implications are staggering, but the geopolitical implications may be even larger. Consider what this law signals to Tehran. Consider what it signals to Ankara. Consider what it signals to the 1.8 billion Muslims watching this conflict unfold. Iran's response was swift. Iranian officials publicly warned that Israel's gallows policy would not go unanswered, that those who passed this law would face consequences, that the machinery of revenge was already in motion. And here is the tragic dimension that no political calculation can erase. Behind every number in that 10,000-person prisoner count is a human being. Behind every vote in that 62 to 47 tally is a political calculation made by someone who will never personally face its consequences. There is a young boy somewhere in Gaza right now carrying 2 heavy water containers down a destroyed street. He is not a statistic. He is not a geopolitical variable. He is a child who was born into a conflict he did not choose, in a land he did not get to decide, under conditions he has no power to change. And the law just passed in Jerusalem has made his future, and the future of every person who looks like him, speaks like him, and prays like him, measurably more dangerous. Now let's pull back and look at the bigger picture, Because what is happening within the Western alliance right now is arguably as significant as anything happening on the battlefield. The unified Western Front that Washington counted on is gone. Not weakened, not strained. Gone. Spain is the most dramatic case. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez has ordered Spanish airspace completely closed to American military aircraft targeting Iran. Not a diplomatic protest. Not a strongly worded letter. A direct operational shutdown. American warplanes cannot fly through Spanish skies to reach Iranian targets. And it goes further. The Sanchez government has also barred the use of strategic military bases on Spanish soil for this purpose. Defense Minister Margarita Robles and Economy Minister Carlos Cuerpo framed this decision clearly. Spain will not be complicit in what they characterized as a unilateral, illegal military escalation that violates international law. Trump threatened sanctions. Trump applied economic pressure. Spain didn't move. What Sanchez is doing, and he knows exactly what he is doing, is giving Europe a demonstration of what sovereign independence from Washington actually looks like in practice. Not in speeches, in closed airspace. Italy's defense minister Guido Crosetto was equally blunt. His government did not support this war. Nobody asked Italy for its opinion. And drawing comparisons between Iran and Ukraine, as some in Washington attempted, is in his assessment a catastrophic analytical error. Iran has a population, a history, and a state apparatus that makes it a fundamentally different challenge. Any occupying force, he implied, would find Iran to be a catastrophic quagmire. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has maintained deliberate distance with language that could not be more carefully chosen. This is not our war. The British government will not commit British forces, British bases, or British political capital to this operation. The European Union has formally called on Israel to halt its military operations in Lebanon. The bloc that was supposed to stand shoulder to shoulder with Washington and Tel Aviv is now publicly calling for a ceasefire in one of Israel's active theaters of operation. And Germany has moved from cautious concern to open alarm. Senior German officials have stated publicly that this war risks becoming a civilizational catastrophe for Europe, not because of direct military involvement, but because of the secondary consequences. Millions of refugees, economic disruption to energy supplies, the collapse of whatever regional stability remained. We started this fire, the message from Berlin implies. We will not burn in it. The message coming from European capitals, stated in varying degrees of diplomatic directness, is this. You started this fire. We will not burn in it. And underneath all of this is a question that no one in Washington seems to be asking loudly enough. If your closest allies, treaty partners, fellow democracies, members of the most powerful military alliance in human history, are closing their skies and distancing themselves from your war, what does that tell you about whether this war is just, winnable, or wise? Now we come to the most technically alarming development of this entire crisis. One that could, without exaggeration, trigger a conflict that makes everything discussed so far look like a prelude. For Iranian ballistic missiles have now been intercepted over Turkish airspace since the U.S.-Israel-Iran war began. 4. The first could be dismissed as a navigational malfunction. The second raised eyebrows. The third prompted emergency consultations. The fourth, intercepted this past Monday by NATO air defense systems, has ended any serious discussion of coincidence. These are not stray rockets missing their targets by a few kilometers. The flight paths, the trajectories, and the specific zones these missiles pass through point towards some of the most strategically sensitive real estate in the entire NATO alliance. The Kursik radar station in Malaya, a critical NATO early warning system that monitors ballistic missile launches across the entire Middle East. And in Sirlik Air Base, home not only to American forces, but to Turkish, Polish, and Qatari military personnel, and believed to house NATO nuclear assets. If a single one of these missiles had struck in Sirlik, we would not be discussing a regional conflict. We would be discussing Article 5 of the NATO Charter, the collective defense clause that would obligate every NATO member to respond militarily. Now here is where this becomes genuinely murky, and where honest analysis requires acknowledging competing explanations. First explanation. These are Iranian ballistic missiles that have genuinely gone off course, the product of degraded guidance systems resulting from the sustained strikes Iran has absorbed. Iran's military infrastructure has taken significant damage, and compromised navigation systems could produce exactly this pattern. Second explanation. Iran is deliberately probing NATO's patience, sending a message, testing how many times it can put rockets into Turkish airspace before Turkey stops merely intercepting them and starts hitting back. This would be consistent with Iran's broader doctrine of calibrated escalation, doing just enough to demonstrate capability without triggering an all-out response. Third explanation, and this is the one Turkish analysts are taking most seriously in private. These missiles did not come from Iran at all. The trajectory, the timing, coming precisely as diplomatic negotiations were gaining momentum in Islamabad, and the specific targets suggest the possible involvement of outside intelligence operations designed to pull Turkey off its position of non-participation and drag Ankara into active conflict. Turkey's situation is uniquely complicated. Ankara has been one of the loudest voices calling the American and Israeli military campaign against Iran illegal. Turkey has refused to join the coalition against Tehran. At the same time, Turkey is a NATO member, and NATO members don't simply watch while rockets fly through their territory. General Selçuk Bayraktar has held emergency consultations with NATO's military committee chairman. Turkish officials have been clear. If this continues, Turkey will not limit itself to interception. It will reserve the right to strike the launch points themselves. For Iran, this would mean opening a new and extraordinarily dangerous northern front, one with a military that is modernized, NATO-equipped, and sharing a long land border with Iranian territory. Nobody in this conflict wants that, which is precisely why each of these three possible explanations should terrify us equally. So let's bring all of this together. Iran has formally adopted an offensive revenge doctrine that puts American and Israeli leaders' private residences in its crosshairs. Israel has legally institutionalized the death penalty for Palestinian prisoners through a law whose scope is broad enough to cover thousands of detainees. Trump has issued a 2-minute ultimatum against Iran's entire energy infrastructure. Spain has shut its skies against American warplanes. Germany, Italy, and the UK are openly distancing themselves from the war their most powerful ally is fighting. And mysterious ballistic missiles are appearing over Turkish airspace that could, depending on whose explanation you believe, be accidents, Iranian provocation, or something else entirely. Each of these developments, in isolation, would be a serious geopolitical story. Together, they form something more alarming, a system that is losing its ability to contain itself. The mechanisms that usually prevent small conflicts from becoming world wars, alliance solidarity, diplomatic backchannels, shared economic interests, the basic rationality of leaders who fear escalation, all of those mechanisms are now under simultaneous stress. Every war, at some point, had a moment where it could still have been stopped. A decision that hadn't yet been made. A button that hadn't yet been pushed. A phone call that could still have been answered. We are in one of those moments right now. Whether the people who have the power to make those decisions are paying attention, that is the question none of us can answer from the outside. What you can do is stay informed. Hit the like button if this breakdown gave you real clarity on what is actually happening. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because in a story moving this fast, you cannot afford to be hours behind. We'll see you in the next one. Stay.